Dances with Robots, a conversation with John Underkoffler, Part 1.
John Underkoffler, it is such a pleasure to have you on Dances with Robots and to just be in your general virtual aura. Can you tell me, even though I just named you, can you give us your name and maybe describe your environment and your physical appearance today?
Yeah, great. My name, as you accurately foretold, you and Nostradamus, is John Underkoffler, for better or worse, depends how you feel about too many syllables and Teutonic stuff. I am sitting at the moment in a small but lovely studio slash lab that my wife and I and a few other collaborators maintain. Nominally, it is the headquarters, such as those things are, of Treadle and Loam Provisioners, which is just a little LLC that kind of wraps around my present day activities. And you said something about visual appearance or something like
Yeah,
that?
so we're doing visual descriptions of our physical appearances for folks who maybe can't see
Yep.
us,
Great.
which is to say people listening to a podcast.
Right. I would prefer not to describe myself because the less said about that, the better. But the room itself is a 110-year-old, a unit in a 110-year-old brick depot building in downtown Los Angeles. The ceilings are very excitingly about 17 feet high. Behind me is a 25-foot wall filled with pixels, so projected digital stuff that is the substance of a lot of our experiments and work. And there's a 17-foot pixel wall just abutting it at 90 degrees. And those who are seeing a visual version of the podcast will be able to see me kind of wedged into the visual corner of those two walls.
Excellent. Thank you. Dear listener, am Sydney Skybetter. I'm a dean here at Brown University. I am wearing transparent glasses with black headphones, a blue-collared shirt, and I'm surrounded by just oodles and oodles of books and robots, as you do. John, maybe just to tee us off, who are you and what do you do? What's your the 30 seconds about who the fuck John Underkoffler is?
I don't know. I don't think I've ever been asked that exactly that way before. I'm a standard issue hominid, and trying, as I
Thank you.
assume most of us are, to make the most of the little wisp of time we have here and figure it all out along the way. Professionally speaking, maybe most accurately and reductively described as an interface designer, a UI designer, computer scientist. I don't know exactly what, and I'm happy to keep it kind of vague and diffuse like that. But that's what we use if a few words has to suffice.
Yeah. I'm getting kind of a vibe somewhere between like Doctor Strange and Carl Sagan. It's kind of the aura today, maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, that again is not for me to say, but Sagan had it going on. He really did, for a number of reasons that we can talk about.
Yeah, billions and billions of pixels.
That's right.
Let's just start at the beginning. One of the first kinds of kind of inflection points in your career that I started following was indeed your work at MIT and your graduate studies. I wonder if you can maybe sort of roll back the clock. I guess this would be like mid late 90s. Can you talk us a little bit through about like your early professional interests and ambitions? How do you wind up at MIT and what do you do there?
Well, that takes us back, I think, probably into the 70s or 80s, and isn't that telling? But I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, probably about 35 miles from Philadelphia, but in a substantially rural place on an old farm, a non-working farm, and I think the sort of exposure to biological forms, plants and animals, of which there were a lot roaming around or sitting there, depending on flora or fauna, had a big influence on the way that I think about digital media and what we should be doing with these little monsters we're creating. But when I was 12, I took a trip, probably my first unsupervised trip, to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and spent a week with my father's youngest sister, a marvelous bohemian young woman at the time who lived in a kind of communal house I have extremely vivid memories of it, and among a huge variety of other activities, so I took public transport. I think she was actually living in Watertown at the time. Took public transport with her and a giant stack of fancy-looking folded things that were part of her work that she was dropping off. And it turned out that, among other things, she was a calligrapher who did the diplomas for MIT. And so we dropped off a couple of armloads of inscribed diplomas. I guess that probably puts us sometime in the spring. And after she dropped those off, she took me on a little tour of the halls, the interconnected hallways of MIT, and she took me up to the third or fourth floor of one of the main buildings and took me to what is now known as Strobe Alley, which is the kind of repository of Doc Edgerton's kind of photographic inventions, but also art. And there are, if you've been to Strobe Alley, there are a couple of live demos where you can press buttons and watch water droplets go backwards by the action of carefully timed strobes and so forth. And I knew in that instant that I wanted to spend a good, probably unhealthy amount of time at this place. And so I wouldn't say I became obsessed, I just became certain that a place like that was where I should I should spend the next interval of my life. And so I had to get through another few years of education, and it wasn't, of course, a foregone conclusion, but I did end up as an undergrad at MIT, and I just with way more fortune than anyone should ever be entitled to, I happened to land there as a tiny little freshman undergrad the very same year that the MIT Media Lab opened. Actually, it was before it had officially opened its doors. And I joined the Media Lab in the spatial imaging group, which was the holography division under the advisorship of Stephen Benton, who's no longer with us, but was a tremendous figure in science and to some degree art as well. And I just lived and breathed that place. I mean, the Media Lab was an astonishing creation. It seems obvious in retrospect, but the Negroponte's message in 1984 and probably 1981 and 2, as he was going around the globe fundraising for it, was really radical, right? The message was this: hey, girls and boys, listen, these computer things that everybody's talking about, turns out they're not substantially and not primarily about spreadsheets and databases. They're really about communication. Today, that's self-evident, and we take it for granted all the time, to the point where we don't even see the computer piece anymore. But then it was a big deal. And so for the first 8 years, I was a laser physics weenie, making 3D images late at night after the subway had stopped running in the basement on giant floating vibration isolation tables and blah, 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 blah. So that was the beginning of a 14-year trajectory at the Media Lab.
Yeah, fascinating. So then, in terms of your graduate work, and I'm thinking here about like how it is that you start working with gesture, how you start going from holography to interface design. Like, I wonder if you can sort of paint that arc for us. Like, how do you get from one twain to the next?
Yeah, well, I mean, real holography, the term is completely appropriated and debauched and trampled, but real holography is still astonishing. Like when you see a hologram that's been made through the action of interference and diffraction and probably laser light and high fidelity, extremely fine-grained, photographic recording media, it's quite something, and it's sort of, it's as much reality as your eyes care to assess.
Perceive. Yeah.
And so that was great for a while, and around the mid-'80s, a little after the mid-'80s, we started a project to build the world's first electronic holography system, which was a huge undertaking in terms of what computers were capable of and the underlying material science. And could you generate a diffraction pattern and shoot it using a tellurium dioxide acousto-optic modulator into a little tiny chunk of crystal and then blast a laser beam through it, and there was just enough happening to create a tiny little 3D image. Yeah. But ultimately, I became frustrated that wasn't going fast enough, and that we couldn't make it interactive. It couldn't move enough, and I just felt like the real promise of widespread computation was a style and a kind and a level of interaction that could serve as a proper kind of extension and maybe like conversant, like an interactive pal for human beings. I don't mean that in a AI or agent sense, but an extension of human will, and that required de facto, I think, a kind and again a level, a degree, and a verisimilitude of interaction and motion and responsiveness that we still haven't attained, but that became kind of my fixation, and so I sort of hopped from one track to another, and Nicholas Negroponte himself was kind enough to take me on as what would turn out to be his last graduate student, and I proposed to him at the time, probably about 1994, that we build the metaverse, because I and everyone else had just finished reading Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash. Right, and that word has come back to haunt us. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that was the beginning of that, and so I sort of dove into the idea that, okay, let's use every pixel available to us, and let's build worlds that are worthy of human cognition.
That's sort of a tactically kind of utopian thing you just said there. Worthy of human cognition. So to maybe
I think at a certain age, if we're honest with ourselves, all of this stuff becomes philosophical and political, and there's a huge effort, and always has been, around in the digital realm, in the computer realm, to pretend that, as science and engineering most often has, that it's exempt from concerns of philosophy, ethics, politics, but to sort of let go of that, to abnegate the connection, is just to leave it in the hands of forces that'll do worse with it. So
fair play. Well, and something I've long appreciated about your work in its various instantiations is that, like, the interface is centered on the body in a very mindful and thoughtful way. And so in that fashion, we're not talking about like ambient computing per se, but rather like a mode of interface that constantly centers and recenters the body and bodily concern, bodily expressivity, bodily performance. Okay. And so in that mind, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about G-Speak. And like this project, which had, I think, a kind of legs, as it were. It certainly sparked the imaginations, the imaginings of any number of other artists and creative technologists. Where did G-Speak come from, and how, like, I mean, kind of literally, practically, like, where, in terms of the motion, in terms of the technology, like, how did that imagining happen for you?
Yeah, I think dreary though it is, I mean, we can sort of track G-Speak as a set of ideas that's also instantiated in a code base, and that came about toward the middle and end of the 90s, after Negroponte very reasonably had kind of concluded I was spinning my square wheels and thought it might be time for me to go spin them elsewhere, potentially. But it was around that time that the magnificent Professor Hiroshi Ishii, I don't know, took pity on me, or thought that there was something salvageable. And so I ended up with a kind of dual advisor situation, and really the structure and kind of beautiful, kind of tangible and poetic surround that Hiroshi put around his work and his concerns kind of caused the last piece to fall into place for me. And that was the moment when I sort of abandoned the mouse and really said, let's make it fully architectural, fully environmental. We've got human hands. Let's not use this horrible little chunk of plastic as a reductive intermediary. And so I began building a set of demos and a system that was called the Luminous Room, which was sort of a wrapper around a bunch of demos. But the code that ran that was the first instantiation of G-Speak. It didn't come to have the name G-Speak until the middle of Minority Report, when I published a thing called the G-Speak Handbook, for all of the actors and producers and director and other people to presumably not read, which is why I had to go back and make a video. But that's the first time the term came into existence. And I know we're not talking about the word. So the idea of an operating system really whose whose primary concerns were those of the human world at the most in the most primal way, which is to say, spatial and temporal was the basic idea there. And I'm already very much on public record as pointing out that every programming language in the world, minus one or two more recent ones, has completely ignored those most salient, most important aspects of biological existence, space and time. And is it because they're the legacies of a bunch of abstract logicians and mathematicians? Is it because they came into being at a time between two world wars, or sort of in consonance with the second one, where we'd kind of given up the idea that aesthetic concerns and engineering concerns are really the same thing and should remain together, and you were either a humanities person or you were an engineer, that's I don't know exactly why. I think part of it is that everything was hard back then, and we were lucky to get a couple of ones and zeros in and out. So to demand on top of that space and time be properly and fairly treated is maybe too much to ask. But we can ask it, and so we did.
Sure. So many follow-up questions. In terms of the actual the way that one navigated the luminous room, yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you imagined and then encoded certain kinds of gestures, or how did you determine what kinds of movements or movement modalities would result in what kind of functionality?
Yeah.
So that you mentioned the spatial and the temporal, and these for us in the dance world are the building blocks of choreographic practice, right? Literally how movement through space and time creates meaning can either be about interface design, choreography, or both. And I think in your case, it's very much both. Yeah. So where did these gestures kind of literally come from? How did you decide that a certain thing meant and should function as a certain thing?
I guess this is a great opportunity to very precisely correct the chronological record here. So through the not for anything that you said, but for murk that I've allowed into the stream of history, through the end of the 90s and my work at the Media Lab, the luminous room, I think almost without exception, mediated the kind of gestural intent through physical objects, and this was part of the overlay of the tangible media ethos, right? So,
sure.
If you were working with an architectural simulation, the building itself would be kind of an avatar for a much larger version of itself, and you would grab the building and you would move it around. The shadows would follow, the projected digital shadows would follow the building, and you had a little clock and you could spin the time around, and therefore the time of day and the sun's position, again affecting the shadows. You could affect a wind simulation and so forth. And so that, from an academic point of view, there's something very interesting to assess there. Is the accumulation of necessary objects a good thing? What's the limit of that? Right? So there was almost never a case in those systems where you were using hands unencumbered or unaugmented with physical objects. You would pick up a literal tool to mean something, and there are great consequences to that. The system knows when you mean a particular thing because you actually picked up that tool.
Do the thing, yeah.
So it was the transition from that to the minority report system that required kind of a slight rethink, because in the context of the film, it was going to be purely, freehand gestural, and that allowed the stuff to literally be put down, and the aperture opened way up.
Yeah.
And so it makes things both easier and harder at that moment. But the idea was we were going to have actors or really diegetic characters pointing at screens and using a fairly small gestural vocabulary to conduct data, to conduct information, and get at results that were important to the story.
Fight crime, yeah. So then, to maybe, I'm going to take this in a kind of a two-parter here. First, I wonder if you could just sort of tell the story about how the hell Minority Report happened, from your vantage point. Like I can imagine that you get like a phone call or something, and it's like Alex McDowell will be like, "What's up, man?" Or something. Um, but like I'm super curious then, especially given the kind of elaboration in the time stream there of like, well, so you're in the Minority Report process. This is a thing that's happening, and then you can you create, you choreograph, you concoct, you revisit a kind of gestural vocabulary. Like I'm really curious, like where the gestures came from,
Right.
and the who and the what of that. But tell us the Minority Report story. Where the hell does that come from?
Yeah, where indeed? I mean, it's the kind of, completely unplannable accident that gives rise to the most meaningful bits of lives, I'm pretty sure. But I'd finished my dissertation, and I was I think, a postdoc at the time for 9 months or a year. And it was at that moment that Alex McDowell, the brilliant production designer of Minority Report and so many other really, really worthwhile films, came on a kind of whirlwind junket tour, visit, research, sortie to the Media Lab, and he brought with him Jerry Moss, also no longer with us, great prop master. But basically, Alex was scouring the planet looking for little bits and pieces of emerging technology, but even more than that, emerging thought about technology that he could import in a meaningful way into the film. Minority Report had been up and down a couple of times, and it had gone away, but it had suddenly come back with a vengeance, and it was really going to happen. And Alex is an amazing mind and a great thinker, but he'd been tasked, I suspect, somewhat terrifyingly by Spielberg with the job of creating an actual 2054. At that point, it was actually 2080, not a set, not a sketch. But Spielberg was quite clear that this wasn't going to be science fiction, even though the source material was nominally science fiction. We can talk about Phil K. Dick in a minute, sure, and how that probably is not most importantly science fiction, but rather something else. This was going to be Stevens' film noir, and if you look at how it was shot and the grain and the high contrast and the rest of it, it's really working in noir territory. And for that to be true, Steven felt, and correctly so, that the futurist part, the technology, the science, all the wonderful or not wonderful stuff that happens between, in the next 50 years, now 30, I suppose, would have to seem self-evident. It would have to seem to the viewer, oh yeah, if we just waited around 50 years, that's what we'd get, rather than it seeming like a bunch of disconnected set pieces with cool gadgets. And so that in turn meant that Alex was really tasked with constructing a real world. Yep. That was also the beginning of his interest in what he now calls world building, and that's a separate practice, which is great. And that meant, we had to know what was going on with architecture and urban planning. That was really, really important for the film. We had to know what was going on with medicine and politics and a bunch of other stuff. But we also had to know in an integrated way what was going on with technology. And when he visited the Media Lab and I showed him the Luminous Room stuff, we got along immediately because I'm a film nerd from way back, and I couldn't wait to talk with him about Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and Fight Club and all that he'd just done. But he said, wait a minute, this stuff I think might solve one of our biggest kind of unaddressed problems, which is that Steven keeps asking me, what do computers look like in 2080? And I'm very grateful for Steven literally saying, yeah, tell me, Alex, that it's not keyboards and mice still. And so the production had already, I think, at that time designed this huge curved screen where information could be arrayed, but no one knew how you were going to interact with it. And when Alex saw that very embodied kind of human-centered and kind of pre or proto-gestural stuff, he thought that could be it. And there was then later the phone call, according to your allusion, and I had a great time with Alex, and then some months went by, and then I got a phone call. In my memory, it's like 3 a.m. Of course, it probably isn't really, but the phone call goes like, "Do you?"
Midnight LA time. I mean.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Would you? We talked about you helping out the production. Are you serious? Would you like to? And I said, yeah, I definitely like to. And he said, all right, get on a plane.
What happens next? Watch part 2 to find out.
Brown University's Department of Theater Arts and Performance Studies Conference for Research on Choreographic Interfaces thanks the Marshall Woods Lectureships Foundation of Fine Arts, the Brown Arts Initiative, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for their generous support of this project. DWR, an interview with John Underkoffler. Thank you to John Underkoffler for spending time nerding out with us. For more info, visit https://www.linkedin.com/in/John-Underkoffler/. The Circe team. Sydney Skybetter, Circe founder. Ariane Michaud, executive producer. Kate Gao, archivist and producer. Dances with Robots team. Laurel Lawson, accessibility consultant. Megan Hall, podcasting consultant. Kamal Sankram, music commission. Jim Moses, sound editor. Rishika Kartik, student associate. Thank you to TAPS at Brown University. Chris Reddyhan, academic department manager. Alex Norton, academic events and facilities manager. Brianne Shaw, communications and audience services manager. Thank you to the Brown Arts Initiative at Brown University. Kira Del Sesto, Sophia Lacava Bohannon, Peter Chanot, Chuan Ju, Nix Bennett, and a huge thank you to Rebecca Rex in the Office of Corporate and Foundation Relations. Thank you to the OnTap podcast for supporting early ideas around this project, and Panel Camp for sending over valuable resources. More info at ontappod.com. More on Circe at https://choreographicinterfaces.org/. Listen to our podcast, Dances with Robots, www.danceswithrobots.org.